So I think the biggest problem is that the U.S. has isolated itself. The U.S. decision to withdraw is opposed by all of the other important parties to the agreement, in particular the Europeans and Russia and China, because they think the nuclear agreement is working for the time being to constrain Iran's nuclear program. So instead of taking something that's working and trying to work with its allies on other issues of Iranian behavior that the U.S. opposes, the U.S. has now isolated itself and weakened its ability to get European help on other issues of concern, like Iran's ballistic missile program and influence of Iran in the region. I don't think so. I mean, the decision to isolate the nuclear issue and focus on it as the highest priority was actually a decision made by President Bush. So even before Obama came into office, the U.S. strategy toward Iran was to negotiate limits on Iran's nuclear program so Iran could not acquire nuclear weapons. And that was seen as the most important threat to regional stability as well as the security of U.S. allies in the region, like Israel. So the decision to focus on the nuclear issue and to use sanctions as leverage to force Iran to make concessions on the nuclear issue, that was a very important strategic decision. If we had tried to do a broader agreement that dealt with other aspects of Iranian behavior, I think it would have been possible, just not possible, to come to an agreement. And the problem with Trump's strategy is that he wants to have what he calls a bigger and better deal that would offer more incentives to Iran, like lifting all sanctions, but in return asking Iran to change its foreign policy totally. And I think that's completely unrealistic. I don't think the Islamic Republic is prepared to change everything about its foreign policy, even if the U.S. offers normalized political and economic relations. So I think it really depends on what Iran does now. The Iranians, of course, are threatening to withdraw from the nuclear agreement and to resume their nuclear program unless they get adequate economic benefit and compensation from the other parties to the agreement. So if the Iranians decide that they're getting enough economic benefit, they're still able to sell their oil, they're still able to do business with some European and Russian and Chinese companies, then Iran will stay in the agreement. And as long as they continue to observe those nuclear limits, I think the risk of a U.S. military attack is very small. But if Supreme Leader Khamenei decides after some period of time that Iran is not getting enough economic benefit and withdraws from the agreement and resume its nuclear activities, then I think the risk of a U.S. military attack becomes much greater. Because as soon as Iran resumes its nuclear activities, President Trump will be threatening to attack Iran, and other countries in the region, like Israel and Saudi Arabia, will be encouraging the United States to use military force against Iran. So the big question mark will be, what does Iran do in response to the U.S. withdrawal from the agreement? My guess is that the Iranians will probably be smart and avoid doing something that could provoke a U.S. military attack. And at least for the next 2.5 years, for the rest of President Trump's term, Iran will try to avoid a military conflict with the U.S. Yeah, and the Europeans understand that in order to preserve the JCPOA, they have to try to provide continuing economic benefit to Iran. The problem is that private companies, whatever the governments do, private companies are not going to run the risk of U.S. secondary sanctions because the Iranian market is so small compared to their interests in the U.S. So I think most big European companies will withdraw from the Iranian market, and you're already seeing signs that French oil company Total or car companies like Peugeot and Renault, they will withdraw from the Iranian market. So there will be some economic damage to Iran because of U.S. secondary sanctions. But I think the key will be whether Iran can still sell their oil And right now they're selling 2.5 million barrels a day. If they're able to continue something in that range and oil prices stay about where they are now, then Iran can probably make it through the next 2.5 years anyway without a serious economic collapse.